Hey everyone, welcome to the third lesson in our English language reading sessions. This is all to help you with your GCSE English language papers, and particularly the section A's, anything to do with reading skills, comprehension, analysis, comparison, evaluation, all that good stuff. So in the first week, we did a lesson on language device analysis, being able to pick out language devices, analyze them deeply. If you haven't watched that video, I highly recommend it. Second week, we did word class analysis, so looking through different word types and how to analyze deeply on those. Again, if you haven't already looked at that video, I would highly recommend that video. But this third week, we're going to be going into structural analysis. Now, this is the one that I think more students have real problems with. I'm going to give you some tips, tricks, ideas how to get better at this. Now, what you have to understand about the structural analysis of English language is there are certain questions which will just ask you to look at language. There are certain questions that will ask you to look just at structure, but there are also questions where particularly some of the high mark questions that won't specifically say look at language or look at structure. They'll just use words like evaluate or analyze. So any question that doesn't specify whether it's language or structure, try to use a bit more structure. Structure is something that a lot of level 9 students end up using more because they're not only being able to analyze word choices in language, but they're integrating that structure on top. And that then puts them, head and shoulders above other students that haven't quite got that skill as well. So what I'm going to go through with you today is hopefully going to encourage you to be able to work on the structure specifically if it's a question that's just about structure, but also give you some ideas of how to integrate this into comments you have on language. So most of my students know that an acronym I use for this part of the course is FOPS or FOPPS. I'm going to do FOPPS today just to add a little bit more detail. But the P, the P and the S are very closely linked. So, you can talk about each of them individually, but they're pretty synergistic. But let's start by thinking about this main thing that structure does. So obviously structure holds the pieces together, whatever you're reading, it holds the piece together. But it's also a very good way for the writer to create certain effects. And the effects we're going to particularly look at, because it's the most common one to think about, is how it can be used, how structure can be used to create tension, excitement, anxiety, calmness, but also chaos and mystery. There's loads more than that, but those are some of the very common ways that structure can be used to create an interest or an engagement with the reader. And for most of the questions that you would be asked, that's what you're going to be asked about, like how structure is used to create a certain effect, and normally how that then makes the piece more interesting or engaging. So we're going to dive into that effectively. We're going to dive into that together. So let's just start with this acronym, which, as I said, is pretty important to understanding how to do detailed structure analysis. But as I said, I'm also going to try and link a little bit of language as we read this piece together. And this piece, just so you know, this piece was, I think, 2017 GCSE. So, a few years ago, it was the piece for AQA. But even if you're not sitting AQA, this could still be very useful for you because all of the GCSE exam boards have very similar requirements. All of them have pretty similar extracts. Okay, so let's just talk about FOPPS for a second. So the F stands for focal point or focal shift. Both shifty. Both can be interesting together. Sometimes they're interesting separately. We'll talk about that. Then the O is the order of information. The P is for pace, pacing. It's also for punctuation, the second P. And the S is sentence forms. Now, the reason that I said that these are all quite linked is because depending on how heavy or light the punctuation is, will pretty solidly determine the pace. Because if there's lots of punctuation, obviously that's lots of little hurdles that slows the pace down. Whereas if there's not much punctuation, then that's not so many hurdles, which speeds the piece up. So imagine Usain Bolt, right? He's running 100-meter sprint. How's he going to be faster? Is he going to be faster with a clear track, or is he going to be faster with like several hurdles? Obviously, he's going to be faster with a clear track, right? So think of punctuation in that way. Punctuation are these hurdles. Some of it is necessary to break up clauses, doesn't slow things down that much. Other punctuation is really heavy. So things like ellipsis, you know, that dot, 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 that's heavy punctuation. Semicolon, heavy punctuation. Colon, heavy punctuation. I can't do hyphen. Oh, hyphen did work. Nice. Hyphenation, heavy punctuation. Yeah. Slows things down a lot, affects the pace a lot, but punctuation can also be in its own right very important, because punctuation, say you've got a semicolon or ellipsis, it will slow the pace, but it will also put emphasis around that word or that phrase where that ellipsis is used. So you can look at it from its own point of view, or you can look at it from a pace point of view. Finally, we've got sentence forms. This also ties in really strongly to pace, because obviously, you know, a full stop is a hurdle, right? So if you have like 5 or 6 short sentences, you know, like 5 or 6 words each, you know, blah, 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 full stop, blah, 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 full stop. It's going to be a much slower pace thing than if you have this long, complex sentence, 3 or 4 line sentence. So sentence forms also affect the pace. But again, like with punctuation, it's more than just affecting the pace. So if you have a short sentence, that can again be used really for very strong emphasis on something. So you can also have a contrast between the sentence forms. So you could have a sentence form that is, you know, 3 or 4 lines long, really long, complex sentence, maybe a fairly fast paced line, and then, you know, a 2-word sentence. And obviously that 2-word sentence is going to be so emphasized if we've just had this really long sentence before it. So we can talk about these things in their own right as well, but that's FOPPS. The other thing you can do if you want a bit more detail about this, you can go to ututoring.com/structure, and that will give you a bit more detail on the F, the O, the P, and the S. I don't have a pace one on there, I don't think, but pace is determined, as I said, mostly through punctuation and sentence forms anyway. Okay, so let's read the piece together. So just to give you a little bit of a backstory of it, it's about a character protagonist called Rosabelle. Rosabelle works in a hat shop. It's based in Victorian England, and she has just finished a hard day with some hard clients, some people that came in that were quite demanding. We're not going to read the whole piece. We're just going to read the first 3 paragraphs of it. And as we go through, I want us to focus in and look for, you know, some interesting focal points. Oh, I don't think I told you this. So the focal point is just what the reader or the audience, you know, it can be a visual thing as well, what their attention, what their eye is drawn to. So at the corner of Oxford Circus, Rosabelle bought a bunch of violets, and that was practically the reason why she had so little tea. For a scone and a boiled egg and a cup of cocoa are not sufficient after a hard day's work in a hat shop. As she swung onto the step of the bus, grabbed her skirt with one hand and clung to the railing with the other, Rosabelle thought she would have sacrificed her soul for a good dinner, something hot and strong and filling. So, you know, as I've said to you before, I recommend sort of reading a sentence or reading a paragraph if it's short and then analysing it a little bit. So we've got this quite beautiful image to begin with. So the focal point at the beginning is quite, you know, quite calm, quite beautiful. Rosabelle holding a bunch of violets. So that's a focal point, and it's quite a pleasant focal point. But then what happens is there's then a focal shift to the fact she had so little tea. And at the end, particularly, Rosabelle would have sacrificed her soul for a good dinner, something hot and strong and filling. So the focal point of her carrying these violets, which is quite positive and sort of gives us a positive first impression of Rosabelle, is then juxtaposed and contrasted at the end here with this image of her starving, basically. She is very hungry, and this creates pathos. That's actually another thing I should put. It creates pathos and it potentially creates tension. Let me just add pathos in here as well. So hopefully you can see why tension, pathos, which just means pity, sympathy, excitement, anxiety, panic, calm, chaos, mystery. Hopefully you can see why all of those would create interest. But you have to sort of identify these bits of structure and then work out what kind of interest is being shown. So in this case, I think this first one, particularly, you've got the focal point and focal shift. Rookie mistake. Normally I remember to turn the camera off before starting the recording and the lesson. My bad. Anyway, so the focal point and the focal shift. The other thing I would comment on in this one, anytime you see an unusual piece of punctuation, just think about it for a second, because there's a good chance that it's there for an interesting reason. So the reason why she had so little T, hyphen, yeah, that is also something that you can identify punctuation. And as we've talked about, heavier punctuation like hyphens, which is quite a long pause, are usually there to create some sort of an emphasis on something near the hyphen or whatever the piece of punctuation is. So the fact she had so little T, this reinforces that pathos and emphasis through the hyphen. She hasn't eaten enough. And this heavy pause helps the reader to really notice that. And you could go a bit further. You could say this maybe slows the pace for a moment to mimic the fact that Rosabelle is hungry, very hungry. And when people are hungry, people are slower, more lethargic. So it could be that it's sort of helping to mimic her lack of energy after a very long day of work in the hat shop as well. So you could use that to back that up. Okay, so we've done a little bit on focal points and focal shifts in there. We've done a little bit on punctuation in there. Now we'll probably find some more, but I want to try to get a bit of everything if I can. Now, the only other thing that we sort of subtly talked about is order of information, because at the beginning of the paragraph, we have this positive, let me just add that actually. So it starts with a positive connotation of Rosabelle. Literally in the first sentence, this then is contrasted at the end of the first paragraph, generating pity and concern, pathos and concern for her. So if you're going to talk about the order of information, some good things to do is look at the beginning of paragraphs, look at the end of paragraphs, because typically a writer will put something quite strong at the beginning of a paragraph or quite strong at the end of a paragraph. And he or she, I forget the writer actually, but has done both in this first paragraph. All right, let's look at the next paragraph. So Rosabelle looked out of the windows. The street was blurred and misty, but light striking on the panes turned their dullness to opal and silver. And the jeweler's shops seen through this were fairy palaces. So we might be able to talk about a little bit of pace here. Her feet were horribly wet, and she knew the bottom of her skirt and petticoat would be coated with black, greasy mud. There was a sickening smell of warm humanity. It seemed to be oozing out of everybody in the bus, and everybody had the same expression, sitting so still, staring in front of them. Rosabelle stirred suddenly and unfastened the two top buttons of her coat. She felt almost stifled. Through her half-closed eyes, the whole row of people on the opposite seat seemed to resolve into one meaningless, staring face. Okay, good. So what we probably notice in this paragraph here is we've got some pretty long sentences. So you've got, 2.5 line sentence here. This one's more medium. Then you've got another long sentence here, and then sort of a medium, and then a long sentence. So it's mostly made up of pretty long sentences. Now, one of the reasons for the longer sentence forms, I think, is just to show extra detail. So she's on the bus, she's looking out the windows, she sees the blurry, misty streets of London. There's a focal point, again, light striking on the panes turn their dullness to opal and silver. So, you know, this is an interesting image because the streets are kind of blurry through the window of the bus, but they're also kind of these beautiful colors of opal and silver. And they were even, she felt like fairy palaces. Now, when you combine some of those images in here and you see that it's this long, complex sentence, we get a little bit of a sense of excitement and wonder from Rosabelle, right? So longer, more complex sentence with beautiful focal point and imagery adds interest because we get the sense that Rosabelle is a dreamer, thinking of a better time, that sort of thing. And then that's massively what you can then do with the sentence forms is you can look at the next bit. Her feet were horribly wet and she knew the bottom of her skirt and petticoat would be coated with black, greasy mud. So this next slightly shorter sentence juxtaposes the first one. It gives us this horrible focal shift. Shorter sentence. And this is the harsh reality of her actual life. So, you know, we get this kind of excitement and her getting taken away by the streets of London as she looks out at London through the bus window. And, you know, this is the positive dreamlike state that she's trying to, you know, escape her life, basically escape the horrible parts of her life, the fact she's hungry, the fact she's had this hard day's work, the fact she's on this horrible bus. But then it's juxtaposed with this slightly shorter sentence. And we see that while she's trying to look out the window and see better things, she's ultimately really in a position where she's very uncomfortable. And this again generates a lot of pathos and perhaps a little bit of tension and chaos, but definitely it's fairly negative. So we're starting to see this pattern, aren't we? We're starting to see this pattern of like, we have lots of positive thoughts about Rosabelle as a character, but we have quite negative feelings about the life she's having to live and the situation that she's in. Okay, so then let's just look. So that's sort of a little bit on sentence forms, particularly long, complex ones. Let's try and find a short, simple sentence as well if we can. The other thing that I'll just quickly mention is there are several interesting bits of punctuation that you could talk about. So this bit slows down the pace, this bit slows down the pace and emphasizes. You've also got the ellipsis here, yeah? So all of those are possibly things, if we had a bit more time, that I could go through as well on top, but we've already talked a bit about punctuation. Okay. So she began to think of all that had happened during the day. So straight away, short, simple sentence, yeah? Now, we'll talk about that, but we'll also talk about it in terms of the pace. So in these longer sentences, the pace is a little bit faster, and that maybe sort of suggests a little bit of excitement as she's looking out the window, looking at these jewelry shops and how they seem like fairy palaces. So the pace being a bit faster maybe adds a bit of excitement there, or her being swept away, as I said, compared to the next sentence, which is shorter and I would argue slightly slower pace, again, which just shows the kind of discomfort of the world she's in. This bit here is definitely slow pace. She began to think of all that happened during the day. The fact that it's such a short sentence and it's the beginning of a paragraph which emphasizes it as well, I think this slow pace is meant to sort of reflect the exhausting nature of her day. She began to think of all that had happened during the day. So as she sat there, it emphasizes the fact that she's thinking about the day she's had. It also slows the pace and maybe starts to establish a little bit more of a tension and a negative mood about the day that she's had. Slow pace, shorter sentence, start of the paragraph, establishes more negative tone. And then as we go on, if we were to keep reading this, we get to know about this girl, this wealthy woman who had, or this awful woman who had come into her store demanding all kinds of things. And that was one of the major reasons that she had been exhausted. So there you go, that's FOPPS. Now, what I want to do with this one, even more than some of the other ones, other bits, is to give you a little bit of a sense of how to write a paragraph on structure specifically. So question 3 of AQA paper 1 is roughly what I'm going to be looking at here, but I'll try and add in a little bit of thoughts of language like I have throughout, like some of this imagery and stuff, just to help for people who want to see how they marry together a bit. So we'll mostly focus on how structure is used to create types of interest. But we'll, as I said, we might sprinkle a bit of language just so you can see how that works. Just remember, if the question is structure, stick to structure. If it's language, stick to language. If it doesn't give you any reference to whether it should be structure or language, normally that means you could do both, and normally doing both is better. So we'll do a bit of both. We'll focus a bit more on structure though. So one of the ways in which the writer creates interest and engagement from the reader is through the way that Roosevelt is described. Actually, I'm sorry. Is through the contrasting views of Roosevelt. So I'm just going to focus on that for now. Initially, the focal point of the extract of the story is Roosevelt bought a bunch of violets, which has positive connotations for Roosevelt, and violets are a beautiful flower, symbolizing beauty or innocence. Now that second bit where I'm talking about how flowers have beautiful connotations and so on, that's starting to dive more into language. We could go even further if we wanted to. You could talk about bought a bunch, so the alliteration emphasizes it further, but the focal point clearly is positive, even if you don't dive into the language, just an image of a woman with a bunch of flowers, positive image, right? However, this is then almost immediately juxtaposed in the paragraph, especially at the end of the paragraph, with the hyperbole, sacrificed her soul for a good dinner. Now the hyperbole bit obviously is language, so that's me adding in a bit of language so you can sort of bring them together, but we'll go into the focal shift and the structure now. So this is juxtaposing the paragraph, the end, sacrifice herself for a good dinner. This jarring focal shift adds a sense of pathos to Roosevelt as our initial impression of her as a beautiful woman with flowers is then threatened by the lack of food that she has received today. So there are the two focal shifts. If you wanted to add a little bit more on top of that, which we can because we have a couple more minutes, so why not? Furthermore, the use of hyphenation in line 2, it's always good to put line references if you can. To so little tea. Gives emphasis on the message that she has not had enough food, further building the reader's concern and tension in the something like that. So there's a bit of everything in there. That's actually pretty concise as well for me. I'm pretty wordy normally. Yeah, 150 words. But what we've got in there, we've got several bits of structure, how they create a little bit more interest through creating concern, got a couple of focal points and how they shift from one to the other. And then just to show off, we've added some hyphenation in there just to say how that emphasizes this hunger that she has even further. And I just added in a couple of little language bits for those of you who wanted to see how you might marry up some language with some structure. And there you go. That's a little model paragraph really of structure, but also a little bit of language, or at least a taste of how you put language in. So I highly recommend that if you aren't already putting in some structure in those longer, higher mark questions, particularly, try to find some of these elements of FOPPS, focal points and focal shifts, order of information, pace, punctuation, sentence forms. So hopefully that was helpful. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, please comment below. I might be able to stop this in a second. Yeah, thanks very much. See you in the next one.